This video is all about identifying limitations within texts, and it's a guide to critical reading that's relevant to the work that we're doing in Year 10 English. As a starting question to consider limitations, consider the idea of truth. How do you know when something is true? And what are some of the factors that you consider to be important when regarding something as true or untrue? So looking at some of the identified reasons, we usually associate truth to have some kind of evidence to back it up. Sometimes true can be reflected by something we've heard or read somewhere. It might be something that we've witnessed or something that we've seen. It could be something that you saw on TV or in a movie. Perhaps you heard it from somebody. Maybe someone important said it. Perhaps you've had a personal experience that in some way or other has confirmed that to be true. Or maybe it's just the fact that everyone you know seems to agree with it. On the opposite side of this, what are some of the things that we look for when something is not true? If we have a look at this list, we can see that a lot of these are really the reverse of what we saw before. While everyone might agree that something is true, if nobody agrees, then perhaps it's less likely to be true. In a similar way, a lack of evidence might mean that something's not true. There's an interesting one down here about contextual relevance, and what that means is something might be true in a particular circumstance, but not true in other circumstances. Bias could also be a reason that we don't believe something to be true if the person who's telling us has a reason to change that information, or if we just don't trust the person who said it. Maybe we don't have any sense of their authority, maybe they're not an expert. And the last point is about when something doesn't line up with other information. If I receive two accounts of the same event and they don't line up, does that compromise my ability to determine what is or is not true? Limitations are what this video is all about, and it's a factor that might affect whether something is true. So here's a couple of scenarios, and you might choose to have a chat with someone nearby, maybe someone at home if you're watching this at home, but just to think about some limitations. So if someone's best friend says that they would be great for a job, what might be the limitations of that information? In what ways might that not be true? Let's say a citizen, like one person, claims the police are corrupt. What are some of the limitations of that information that might mean that it's possibly not true? If I read two accounts of a story that don't match, what might be some of the limitations there that could affect whether that information is true or not? Or what about this one's always interesting? A scientist claims that the Earth is flat. It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because, well, if they're a scientist, maybe they've got a degree, maybe they're educated, maybe they've got all the credentials. But what if they're the only one who claims the Earth is flat? Why might that affect our perception of whether or not it's true? So these are some of the tricky questions that we ask when we're considering limitations in texts. Let's look at one of these a little bit closer. So in the circumstance where someone's best friend says that they'd be good for a job, what are some of the factors in this circumstance that might lead to information not being true? Well, here's some suggestions. It's not unreasonable that someone might lie in order to help a friend get a job. In the sense, you're my best friend, I really want you to get a job, so whether you are good at it or not, I'm still going to say something nice about you because I really want you to get the job. So that would be an example of bias. Something else that might happen is your best friend might say you're really good at a job, but your best friend might not know anything about the job itself, so they don't necessarily have what we would call the authority to say whether the friend would be good or not. They're not an expert in the job, they don't know what needs to happen within the job, all of that sort of stuff. So authority might be a reason or a limitation why this information might not be true. The third one here is this concept that even though they're your best friend and you spend heaps of time with them outside of the workplace, you might have never seen the person in the workplace. So you might say something like, they're really motivated and they're really hardworking and they're really kind, but that's a contextual limitation because you haven't seen them in a work environment. So this is just some examples of the reasons why something might be limited in terms of the information we get. And really all information has limitations of some sort, and being able to identify or infer those limitations is the skill that we're looking to develop. This comes back to the key skill associated with our unit, critical reading, which is about identifying connections and limitations within and across texts. So being critical of something means that you're looking at it really carefully and you're considering what things in that information could be questionable rather than just lightly reading it and taking it all as a fact. Let's look at a couple of examples to illustrate how this skill looks in regards to our assessment. A taxi driver saw a woman who he believed to be Michelle near the phone boxes at the Frankston railway station between 8 and 9 p.m. If I asked you to think about limitations, you might ask yourself, why might this person possibly not be Michelle? What are some of the limitations that could mean that this is not Michelle? Well, let's pull some of these apart in some different categories. The first interpretation is when we take things really literally, and this is a skill that we actually want to move away from, and I'll show you the difference in just a moment. But if I'm thinking about the taxi driver and I'm talking about limitations, sometimes we think about that as what are the limitations for the taxi driver. Let's say, for example, he was far away, he couldn't see properly, perhaps because he was working, maybe there was someone in the back of the taxi so he couldn't stop and get out. The girl might have been turned around, hard to recognise. What we're thinking about in this case is what we call circumstantial limitations. We're thinking specifically of the taxi driver in this story and the things that he can and cannot do. So when we're doing a literal limitation, we're thinking about things in the story, but we're not thinking about the information itself. Let's look at a difference. This is what we call inferred limitations. So these are things that are not specific to the taxi driver. These are questions that we would ask about the information itself. So the difference here saying the witness didn't know Michelle, just her description. So it could have been anyone. Now obviously this is still about the taxi driver, but it's more general than that. It's suggesting that if a witness doesn't actually know what the person specifically looks like or isn't familiar with the person, then the likelihood that they're able to identify the person is going to be reduced. Another inferred limitation is that he wasn't certain of the time. Now he said that it was between 8 and 9 p.m. That's a fairly long amount of time, and we can infer from that that this person or this source wasn't attentive to specific details. Like if this piece of information suggested that she was spotted at 8:15 p.m, that would be really specific and attentive to details. But if someone's been sitting there for an hour and they haven't looked at their watch or they're not aware of just the time that it is, then it's likely that they're not going to be aware of a lot of other little details as well. So that's something we can infer. The last one we can see is we don't know how close the phone boxes are to the station. So there's a possible limitation whenever someone says that they're near something, because we don't have a sense of how close that is. You know, is that within 5 meters? Is that within 20 meters? Is that within 50 meters? So when things aren't exact or they're made on sort of predictions or generalizations, it makes it less definite and therefore creates a limitation to what we would consider to be true. I want to show you now how we take this skill set a little bit further. We've already looked at this idea that the taxi driver spotted someone who seemed to be Michelle at the railway station. This is another source. Reads, we heard another female scream echo from the suburbs. It's hard to tell, but I think it was from the direction of the train station, but it sounded closer than that. We live about 3 blocks away from the station. The Food Plus is further away from our place than the station. It's usually about a 10-minute drive, while the station is about 1 minute away. So in this case, we're still looking at the case of Michelle. So my question is, why might this not be Michelle? Now, let's have a look at what a connection looks like in terms of limitations, because we don't always look at every piece of evidence individually. We build on our understanding. So if we look at this, one of the limitations is that we don't actually know that Michelle made it to the train station in the first place. Our only indicator that Michelle was anywhere near this area was the taxi driver, but the taxi driver's account had limitations to it as well. So there's sort of what we would call a compounding limitation here, because if the taxi driver didn't see Michelle, then Michelle might have never even made it to the train station, so therefore she's not likely to be the person who screamed. So we can sort of start to recognize different limitations here. I want to show you two examples of limitations that are related to this case, and I want to show you how we would score these examples differently based on the skill set that we want to see. We've already indicated that we don't want to see people taking things literally. When you're thinking about a limitation, I don't want you to think about how the person in the story was limited. I want you to think about the information and how it was limited. So let's have a look at this first example. One limitation is that Stephanie couldn't leave her kids, so she wasn't able to go investigate the sound. So she didn't get any more information or see what has happened. If she'd left the kids, then she might have been hurt, or the children might have been in danger, and for this reason she called the police but didn't have much to tell them. This is a great example of a literal or a circumstantial limitation, because what this person is talking about is not the limitations of the information, but the limitations of Stephanie. Because Stephanie couldn't leave the house, therefore she couldn't get any more information. But we're actually not talking about how she was limited. We're talking about how the information was limited. Let's look at the second example. Our only indication that Michelle might be in the area at this time is based on the taxi driver who spotted someone of her likeness between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. and the fact that a scream was heard after 9 p.m. In the case the taxi driver was mistaken, then it's plausible that Michelle was not in the area or had already been abducted well before 8 p.m. Hopefully you can see there's a noticeable difference between these two samples. You might guess that one we would regard as a C-level limitation and the other would be an A-level. And the difference is about the thinking that we're seeing. At a C-level, you're very circumstantial, you're thinking about what's literally in the story and what the people can physically do or not do. You're not thinking beyond or around the story. At the A-level, we call that an inferred limitation. And what you're really looking at here is the reliability across multiple sources. So you're not challenging how limited the person was, you're challenging how limited the information and the sources that it comes from is. And that's the difference in thinking that shows your understanding of critical reading at a C level in comparison to an A level. Hopefully you can use these examples to help you form your own limitations around your chosen piece of evidence.